Case 1. Bradford Bishop. A dark station wagon sat abandoned in the dense timber of Great Smoky Mountains National Park, its interior stained with blood, containing an axe, a gas can, and a dog leash. Hundreds of miles away in rural North Carolina, park rangers had already uncovered a shallow pit where 5 human remains had been consumed by fire. The owner of the vehicle, a high-ranking American diplomat fluent in 5 languages, was nowhere to be found. Within weeks, federal authorities launched one of the most extensive international manhunts in history, landing his face on the FBI's 10 most wanted list. He would vanish into thin air, leaving investigators with an unsolved mystery that has endured for half a century. To understand how a respected civil servant reached this point of total destruction, we have to go back to the beginning. William Bradford Bishop Jr. grew up in an environment defined by discipline, academic achievement, and public service. Raised in Pasadena, California, he excelled in his studies, eventually earning a bachelor's degree from Yale University and later securing 2 master's degrees from Middlebury College and UCLA. Those who knew him during his formative years described an ambitious young man focused on cultivating an impeccable reputation. His education laid the groundwork for a life centered on international affairs, positioning him for a prestigious career within the United States government. His professional rise was swift. Joining the U.S. Department of State as a Foreign Service officer, Bishop served in foreign posts across Verona, Milan, Addis Ababa, and Gaborone. He possessed charisma, elite intelligence, and an exceptional facility for foreign languages, speaking Serbo-Croatian, French, Italian, and Amharic. By the mid-1970s, he had settled into an affluent lifestyle in Bethesda, Maryland, living with his wife Annette, their 3 young sons, and his 70-year-old mother Lobelia. To neighbors and colleagues, Bishop represented the ideal diplomat, disciplined, cultured, and devoted to his household. Beneath that polished exterior lay a personality deeply vulnerable to acute psychological pressure. Bishop was driven by an overwhelming desire for status and professional recognition. He held himself and those around him to rigid standards, deriving his self-worth almost entirely from career advancement. Friends noted that beneath his calm demeanor resided an intense obsession with financial stability and social standing, making any potential failure feel like an existential threat to his identity. The early warning signs of his instability emerged in his private struggles with severe insomnia and anxiety. As financial pressures mounted from maintaining his suburban lifestyle, Bishop began taking prescribed medication to manage his deteriorating mental state. Colleagues noted subtle shifts in his behavior, moments where his usual charm gave way to periods of unusual quietness and intense internal frustration. He began to view any professional delay not as a temporary setback, but as an intolerable humiliation. The ultimate collapse began in early 1976. Expecting a major promotion within the State Department that he believed his years of foreign service had earned him, Bishop arrived at work to learn that another employee had received the position instead. The news shattered his carefully constructed sense of self. He left the office that afternoon complaining of illness, carrying a profound sense of failure that quickly transformed into an irrevocable resolve. On the afternoon of March 1, 1976, Bishop withdrew $400 from his bank, visited a local hardware store to purchase a sledgehammer and a gas can, and bought fuel at a local service station. He returned to his Bethesda residence, where his family was gathered. Inside the quiet home, he carried out a systematic attack, ending the lives of his wife, his mother, and his 3 sons. He loaded their remains into the family station wagon, along with the family dog, and drove overnight toward rural North Carolina. There, in an isolated wooded area near Columbia, he attempted to conceal the evidence before driving further south into Tennessee. The investigation began days later when concerned coworkers alerted authorities to his unexplained absence. Officers entering the Bethesda residence discovered signs of a severe domestic tragedy, immediately coordinating with North Carolina officials who had identified the scene in the woods. Federal investigators tracked his vehicle to the Great Smoky Mountains, but the trail went cold at the tree line. Decades of international leads, age-progressed sketches, and sightings across Europe yielded no definitive capture. The case of Bradford Bishop stands as a chilling study in how fragile human composure can be when an identity is built entirely on status. When his expectation of success collapsed, he destroyed everything he had built, leaving behind a haunting legacy of unsolved justice. Case 2. John Allen Rubio. On a quiet afternoon in March 2003, police officers in Brownsville, Texas, responded to an urgent call at a modest apartment on Tyler Street. Inside, responding officers encountered a scene of overwhelming domestic tragedy that stunned even the most seasoned investigators. Standing amidst the quiet apartment was 22-year-old John Allen Rubio, completely calm and offering no resistance as handcuffs were placed around his wrists. Within hours, local authorities realized they were dealing with one of the most disturbing cases of family violence in Texas history. Rubio would ultimately be convicted of capital murder and sentenced to death, a judgment later overturned on appeal before being finalized as life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. To understand how he got here, we have to go back to the beginning. John Allen Rubio grew up on the margins of Brownsville, a border community where his early years were marked by deep poverty, social isolation, and extreme instability. Raised in an environment with minimal structural support, he struggled academically and socially, dropping out of school at an early age. His formative years lacked the grounding elements of stable guidance or consistent health care, leaving him ill-equipped to handle the complex pressures of adult life. Those who knew him during his youth recalled a quiet, withdrawn individual who increasingly retreated into his own inner world. As he reached adulthood, Rubio attempted to establish a traditional family life, living with his partner and their 3 young sons, aged 3 years, 2 years, and 14 months. However, the household faced continuous turmoil, plagued by chronic unemployment, frequent relocations, and dependence on extended family for basic survival. The pressure on the young father mounted steadily. To outsiders, the family appeared to be simply another household struggling against severe economic hardship. Beneath the surface of their daily struggle lay a rapidly deteriorating mental landscape. Rubio possessed an unstable psychological profile, marked by growing paranoia, cognitive impairment, and a profound sense of personal powerlessness. Lacking proper mental health intervention, his thoughts began to warp under the weight of severe psychiatric distress. He became increasingly obsessed with rigid, distorted spiritual concepts, struggling to distinguish reality from internal panic. The early warning signs emerged in the months leading up to the spring of 2003. Relatives noticed subtle, unsettling changes in Rubio's demeanor. He grew increasingly guarded, spent long hours isolated inside the apartment, and began making erratic statements about unseen forces influencing his household. Rather than seeking medical help, the family attributed his behavior to stress and exhaustion, unaware that his mind was slipping into severe psychosis. The spiral accelerated in early March 2003. Isolated from external influences and consumed by unmanaged delusions, Rubio became convinced that an invisible, malevolent presence had taken hold of his home. In his distorted perception, he began to view his own defenseless children not as innocent toddlers, but as sources of spiritual danger. Driven by this profound psychotic break, he rationalized that ending their lives was the only way to protect them from eternal harm. On the day of the tragedy, Rubio acted on these irrational convictions inside the family apartment, taking the lives of his 3 young sons while they were completely defenseless. Shortly after the incident, emergency services were alerted, bringing police officers to the door. Detectives immediately separated Rubio for questioning, where he openly admitted to the acts while offering bizarre, nonsensical explanations rooted in his intense delusions. The investigation moved swiftly as forensic teams documented the scene and medical examiners confirmed the cause of death. During trial proceedings in Cameron County, prosecutors presented overwhelming physical evidence proving Rubio committed the acts intentionally. The defense presented extensive psychiatric testimony, arguing that Rubio suffered from severe, unmanaged mental illness that rendered him incapable of understanding the wrongfulness of his actions. However, the jury rejected the insanity defense, finding him guilty of capital murder and handing down a death sentence. Years later, state appellate courts overturned the conviction due to procedural errors during the original trial. Upon retrial, Rubio was again convicted, but his sentence was modified to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, ensuring his permanent isolation from society. The case of John Allen Rubio remains a chilling testament to the devastating consequences of unchecked psychiatric collapse. It highlights the quiet, hidden dangers that can develop behind closed doors when severe mental illness goes unrecognized, leaving a community forever altered by an unimaginable loss. Case 3. Stephen Sueppel. On the afternoon of March 23, 2008, law enforcement officers sped along Interstate 80 in eastern Iowa in pursuit of a late-model minivan traveling at high speed. As police cruisers closed the distance, the vehicle suddenly veered off the roadway, striking a concrete bridge support and bursting into flames. Responding officers pulled the driver from the wreckage, but he was pronounced dead at the scene. Hours earlier, police entering a quiet suburban home in Iowa City had uncovered a scene of catastrophic domestic devastation, discovering the bodies of a mother and 4 children. The driver of the minivan, a prominent executive and former vice president of Hills Bank and Trust, died before he could ever stand trial. To understand how he got here, we have to go back to the beginning. Stephen Sueppel grew up in Iowa City, embedded in a well-respected local family with deep roots in the community. Intelligent, charming, and ambitious, he pursued a career in finance, eventually earning a degree and ascending through the ranks of the financial sector. Those who knew him during his early years described a clean-cut, polite young man who embodied traditional Midwestern values. His early success positioned him as a rising star within the local business community. Over the next 2 decades, Sueppel built what appeared to be an exemplary life. He became a senior executive at Hills Bank and Trust, earning a substantial income and the complete trust of his colleagues. Outside of work, he married his wife, Cheryl, and together they adopted 4 children, Ethan, Seth, Eleanor, and Addison. To neighbors, friends, and fellow church members, the Sueppels were the picture of suburban success, active in civic life, devoted to their children, and living in an affluent neighborhood. Beneath this image of polished respectability, Sueppel possessed a personality deeply vulnerable to the terror of public failure. He was driven by an intense need to maintain an image of effortless prosperity and social standing. Rather than confronting personal limitations, he relied on his charm and status to mask growing internal insecurities. For Sueppel, reputation was not merely important. It was his entire identity, and the thought of losing it was something his ego could not tolerate. The early warning signs of his unraveling began secretly in the mid-2000s. Facing personal investments and lifestyle costs that outpaced his income, Sueppel breached his professional ethics. Using his executive authority and intimate knowledge of internal accounting systems, he began quietly embezzling funds from the bank. What started as small, covert transfers soon escalated into a massive financial fraud totaling over $5 million. For years, he successfully hid the theft behind falsified ledger entries, living on borrowed time. The spiral reached a breaking point in early 2008. Federal regulators and internal bank auditors detected irregularities in the financial records, launching an immediate, high-priority audit. As investigators closed in, Sueppel realized his double life was over. Indicted on federal charges of embezzlement and money laundering, he was forced to resign in disgrace. Facing decades in federal prison, complete financial ruin, and total public humiliation, his psychological composure disintegrated completely. On the weekend of March 22, 2008, consumed by panic and unable to face the reality of his looming court dates, Sueppel made a horrific decision. On the morning of March 23, inside the quiet family home, he took the lives of his wife, Cheryl, and their 4 young children. Instead of calling authorities, he attempted to end his own life inside the house using carbon monoxide, but failed. Driven by desperate momentum, he left a written confession on a computer, got into the family minivan, and drove onto the highway. When relatives visited the house later that afternoon and discovered the scene, they alerted law enforcement immediately. State troopers spotted Sueppel's vehicle traveling at extreme speeds along Interstate 80. As officers attempted a traffic stop, Sueppel accelerated toward a highway overpass, intentionally steering his vehicle into a concrete bridge support, resulting in a fatal impact that ended his life instantly. The subsequent investigation revealed the full scope of Sueppel's financial crime, linking his imminent federal prosecution directly to the tragedy inside his home. His sudden death deprived surviving family members and the community of courtroom answers, leaving behind only the wreckage of a life built on deception. The case of Steven Sueppel stands as a stark psychological illustration of how far an individual consumed by pride will go to avoid the consequences of their own actions. When faced with the loss of status and freedom, he chose absolute destruction over accountability, leaving an entire community haunted by an unimaginable betrayal. Case 4. Erin Caffey. In the early morning hours of March 1, 2008, emergency responders in Rains County, Texas, rushed toward a rural property near Alba, where a single-family home was completely engulfed in flames. Emerging from the surrounding woods was 46-year-old Terry Caffey, who had crawled hundreds of yards through the dark despite suffering multiple gunshot wounds. At the hospital, as doctors worked to stabilize him, Terry told investigators a harrowing truth. The fire was no accident, and those responsible were people his 16-year-old daughter knew intimately. Hours later, police located Erin Caffey sitting calmly at a friend's house, showing no outward signs of distress. She would ultimately be convicted of capital murder and sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms plus 99 years. To understand how she got here, we have to go back to the beginning. Erin Caffey grew up in a devout, close-knit household in eastern Texas. Her father, Terry, was a church minister, and her mother, Penny, worked as a nursing assistant. Raised alongside her 2 younger brothers, Matthew and Tyler, Erin was heavily involved in her local church community, participating in the choir and maintaining an image of a polite, obedient daughter. To neighbors and congregation members, the Caffeys represented a stable, loving family centered on faith and traditional values. As she entered her mid-teens, Erin began to display a growing resentment toward the strict boundaries established by her parents. In late 2007, she began dating 18-year-old Charlie Wilkinson. The relationship quickly developed an unhealthy intensity. When Terry and Penny discovered troubling details about Wilkinson's background and behavior, they intervened, placing restrictions on Erin's phone usage and instructing her to end the relationship. For Erin, this parental boundary was not viewed as a protective measure, but as an unbearable intrusion on her autonomy. Beneath her soft-spoken exterior lay an emerging psychological rigidity and a profound lack of empathy when challenged. Erin possessed an intense need for control, becoming consumed by anger whenever her desires were thwarted. Rather than accepting her parents' authority or waiting until she reached adulthood, she began to view her family as obstacles to her freedom. Her devotion shifted entirely toward Wilkinson, whom she began to manipulate by framing her parents as oppressive figures standing in the way of their future together. The early warning signs unfolded in early 2008 through secret text messages and private conversations. Erin and Wilkinson began discussing ways to bypass her parents' restrictions. As the weeks passed, casual complaints transformed into deliberate planning. Erin made it clear to Wilkinson and his friend, Charles Wade, that the only way they could truly be together was if her family was eliminated entirely. Her quiet encouragement served as the catalyst for an extreme act of violence. The escalation reached its critical point on the night of February 29, 2008. After meeting at a local restaurant, Wilkinson, Wade, and another teenager drove to the Caffey residence while Erin waited in a vehicle parked down the road. In the early morning hours of March 1, the intruders entered the home and carried out a devastating attack. Penny Caffey and her two young sons, Matthew and Tyler, lost their lives inside the residence. Terry Caffey was critically injured, but managed to survive by crawling out of the burning structure after the attackers ignited the building. The investigation moved with overwhelming speed. From his hospital bed, Terry identified Wilkinson, leading deputies to arrest Wilkinson, Wade, and their accomplices within hours. When questioned, the co-conspirators immediately implicated Erin, revealing that she had not only approved the plan but had actively helped coordinate the logistics. Digital evidence, including text messages and witness statements, corroborated their accounts, establishing her role as the driving force behind the conspiracy. During trial proceedings, prosecutors presented a formidable case demonstrating that Erin organized the attack to escape her parents' authority. Although her defense team argued that she had been manipulated by older teenagers and never intended for her family to lose their lives, the jury rejected these claims. Erin was convicted of capital murder. Rather than receiving the death penalty, she was sentenced to consecutive life terms, ensuring she would serve decades before ever becoming eligible for parole. In the years following the trial, the case took an extraordinary turn when Terry Caffey, having survived his physical injuries, publicly chose to forgive his daughter. He began visiting her in prison, sharing his story of faith and reconciliation with national media outlets. The case of Erin Caffey remains a chilling study in how unchecked teenage resentment, coupled with extreme manipulation, can escalate into unthinkable family destruction. It serves as a haunting reminder of how dangerous hidden anger can be when personal desire is prioritized over human life. Case 5, David Conley. On the afternoon of August 8, 2015, heavily armed tactical units surrounded a residential home on Jackson Shoals Drive in Harris County, Texas. Inside, 48-year-old David Conley had barricaded himself after taking an entire family hostage. For hours, hostage negotiators attempted to establish communication while officers maintained a perimeter around the structure. When tactical teams finally breached the residence, they discovered a scene of devastating domestic tragedy that shocked the city of Houston. Conley surrendered to law enforcement at the scene without firing at officers. He would later be tried, convicted of capital murder, and sentenced to death. To understand how he got here, we have to go back to the beginning. David Conley's life was marked by a long history of volatile behavior, personal instability, and repeated interactions with the criminal justice system. Growing up in Texas, he developed a pattern of aggressive tendencies that persisted into his adult years. Throughout his life, he struggled to maintain stable employment or long-term personal relationships, frequently resorting to intimidation whenever he experienced rejection or loss of control. His early adult record included multiple convictions for domestic assault, establishing a clear pattern of behavior that authorities had repeatedly attempted to manage through judicial interventions. In the mid-2000s, Conley entered a turbulent relationship with Valerie Jackson. Over the years, the couple shared an unstable living situation, marked by frequent separations and mounting domestic tensions. Valerie eventually sought to end the relationship permanently, moving forward with her life and establishing a household with her new partner, Dwayne Jackson. Together, they lived in a quiet Houston neighborhood, caring for 6 children, including one child Conley had fathered with Valerie. To neighbors, the household appeared focused on providing a stable environment for the young family. Beneath Conley's public history lay a personality consumed by dangerous obsession and an overwhelming need for dominance. He possessed an extreme psychological fragility that interpreted any boundary as a personal insult. Unable to accept that Valerie had moved on, Conley viewed her independence as an intolerable challenge to his authority. His mindset was defined by severe possessiveness, where personal pride was prioritized over the safety and well-being of others, including his own child. The warning signs escalated dramatically in the months leading up to August 2015. Refusing to respect Valerie's decision, Conley engaged in a persistent campaign of harassment and stalking. He made repeated unauthorized appearances at her home, sent threatening communications, and actively ignored court-issued protective orders designed to keep him away from the family. Despite legal restrictions and law enforcement interventions, his anger continued to intensify, transforming his obsession into a deliberate plan for retaliation. The final escalation occurred on the morning of August 8, 2015. Armed with a handgun and restraint devices, Conley arrived at the Jackson home on Jackson Shoals Drive. Finding the residence locked, he forced entry through an unlocked window while the family was inside. Once inside, he restrained Valerie, her partner Dwayne, and all 6 children, ranging in age from 6 to 13 years old, holding them captive in a state of terror for several hours. During the prolonged ordeal, Conley carried out a systematic attack against everyone inside the home. Valerie, Dwayne, and 7 members of the household lost their lives during the incident. Amidst the chaos, 10-year-old Nathaniel Jackson demonstrated extraordinary composure, pretending to be unconscious on the floor and remaining completely motionless until the danger passed. His survival provided law enforcement with a vital eyewitness who would later play a crucial role in the prosecution. The police response began after concerned relatives, unable to contact Valerie, requested a welfare check. Deputies dispatched to the scene spotted a body through a window and immediately called for tactical support. As officers attempted to enter, Conley opened fire from inside, initiating a tense standoff. Negotiation teams worked for hours until Conley finally surrendered and was taken into custody by Harris County deputies. The investigation moved forward with overwhelming evidence, including forensic ballistics, forced entry marks, and physical evidence recovered from the scene. During trial proceedings in Harris County, prosecutors presented a detailed timeline showing that Conley acted with calculated premeditation, driven by rejection and spite. The defense attempted to highlight his psychological history, but the jury returned a prompt guilty verdict on multiple counts of capital murder. Conley was sentenced to death. The case of David Conley remains one of the most tragic illustrations of how unaddressed domestic obsession and repeated protection order violations can escalate into unthinkable violence. It serves as a stark reminder of the critical importance of early domestic violence intervention and the devastating cost when boundaries are ignored. Case 6, George Banks. On the morning of September 25, 1982, emergency dispatches flooded the Luzerne County Communications Center, reporting active gunfire across multiple residential locations in Wilkes-Barre and Jenkins Township, Pennsylvania. Responding officers arrived to find a chaotic scene unfolding across 2 neighborhoods, with casualties spanning multiple households. The shooter, armed with a military-style rifle, had fled to a nearby home on Schoolhouse Lane, where he barricaded himself inside and initiated a tense, hours-long standoff with state and local law enforcement. When officers finally negotiated his surrender, they took 42-year-old George Banks into custody. The former prison guard and military veteran had carried out one of the deadliest sprees in Pennsylvania history. To understand how he got here, we have to go back to the beginning. George Banks was born in Wilkes-Barre in 1940. Raised in a racially mixed family in a predominantly white community, he experienced acute social isolation and racial prejudice from an early age. Despite these early challenges, Banks displayed ambition during his young adult years, serving in the United States Army and later securing employment as a correctional officer at the State Correctional Institution at Camp Hill. To those who encountered him in his professional capacity, Banks appeared disciplined, capable, and knowledgeable about law enforcement procedures and firearm handling. Over the next decade, Banks established a complex, highly volatile domestic life. He fathered children with multiple women, maintaining households that were deeply entangled in financial hardship, interpersonal conflict, and legal disputes. Outside of work, Banks presented an image of a protective father figure who sought to provide for his large, extended family. However, his home environment was characterized by intense control, frequent arguments, and escalating emotional instability that drew increasing concern from relatives and neighbors. Beneath his outward discipline, Banks suffered from profound psychological fragility. He possessed an intense paranoia, believing that society, the legal system, and even members of his own community were actively conspiring against him. Over time, Banks developed a deep-seated grievance complex, viewing minor personal setbacks as part of a larger effort to persecute him. He prioritized his need for absolute authority within his personal life, reacting to any challenge with intense hostility and irrational fear. The early warning signs of his total unraveling emerged in the late 1970s and early 1980s. Following a conviction for a non-fatal shooting in 1961, Banks had faced ongoing legal scrutiny, which heightened his distrust of the justice system. In the months leading up to September 1982, his mental state deteriorated rapidly. He became increasingly obsessed with apocalyptic ideas, expressed extreme racial paranoia, and engaged in bitter custody and financial disputes with his former partners. Relatives observed his behavior becoming erratic and unpredictable, yet no formal psychiatric intervention occurred. The tragic spiral reached its breaking point on the night of September 24 and the early morning of September 25, 1982. Consumed by unmanaged paranoia and believing he was losing control over his family, Banks made a calculated decision to initiate a shooting spree. Armed with a semi-automatic rifle, he targeted his own family members and neighbors across 2 separate locations. In total, 13 people lost their lives that morning, including 5 of Banks's own children, their mothers, and innocent bystanders who happened to be nearby. The law enforcement response was immediate and massive. Officers from multiple jurisdictions converged on Wilkes-Barre, establishing a perimeter around the Schoolhouse Lane home where Banks had barricaded himself. Specialized negotiators engaged Banks in extended dialogue, addressing his erratic demands while tactical teams secured the surrounding neighborhood. After several hours of negotiation, Banks surrendered peacefully, handing over his weapon to arresting officers. The subsequent investigation yielded a vast array of evidence, including ballistics analysis, eyewitness statements, and extensive crime scene documentation, establishing that Banks acted with deliberate intent. In 1983, Banks stood trial in Luzerne County, where his defense argued he was legally insane at the time of the offenses. Prosecutors presented evidence of premeditation, and the jury ultimately convicted Banks on 12 counts of first-degree murder, sentencing him to death. The aftermath of the trial turned into one of the longest legal sagas in Pennsylvania judicial history. Over the next 4 decades, execution warrants were repeatedly stayed as defense attorneys filed numerous appeals focused on Banks's mental competency. Multiple psychiatric evaluations determined that his severe mental illness rendered him incompetent to be executed under state law. Banks spent the remainder of his life in state correctional facilities, until his death in custody in 2022 at the age of 82. The case of George Banks remains a tragic case study in the dangers of unmanaged psychiatric breakdown combined with access to high-powered weaponry. It underscores the critical need for early intervention when severe paranoia and domestic disputes emerge, serving as a lasting reminder of a community forever marked by unimaginable loss. Case 7. Richard Baumhammers. On the afternoon of April 28, 2000, local, state, and federal law enforcement units surrounded a quiet home in Moon Township, Pennsylvania, outside Pittsburgh. Inside the residence was 35-year-old Richard Baumhammers, an unemployed attorney who had spent the preceding hours driving across 2 counties, targeting innocent individuals at multiple commercial and religious sites. As tactical officers established a secure perimeter, Baumhammers surrendered to police without firing another shot. The hours-long rampage left 5 people dead and 1 critically injured in one of the most infamous racially motivated hate crimes in modern Pennsylvania history. Baumhammers was subsequently tried, convicted of first-degree murder, and sentenced to death, a penalty later modified to life imprisonment. To understand how he got here, we have to go back to the beginning. Richard Baumhammers grew up in an affluent, highly educated family in the suburbs of Pittsburgh. His father was a respected professor of dentistry, and his mother was a practicing dentist. Baumhammers excelled academically in his youth, graduating from Kent State University before earning a law degree from the Cumberland School of Law at Samford University. He was admitted to the Pennsylvania bar in 1993 and later traveled internationally to study European politics. To family members and professional colleagues, he appeared positioned for a successful career in legal practice and public service. Despite his privileged background, Baumhammers struggled to establish a stable career. Attempts to practice law failed as his professional relationships frayed under mounting personal difficulties. Outside of his family circle, he became increasingly isolated, spending long periods unemployed and living with his parents in Moon Township. His social network evaporated, and his daily routine shifted towards solitary activities, online browsing, and an emerging fixation on fringe political ideologies. Beneath his educated background lay a severe psychological breakdown accompanied by radicalization. Beginning in the mid-1990s, Baumhammers experienced severe mental health deterioration, displaying escalating paranoia and delusional thinking. Lacking stable employment or social accountability, he channeled his internal frustration into violent white supremacist and xenophobic beliefs. He developed an extreme grievance complex, irrationally blaming ethnic minorities, immigrants, and religious groups for his personal and professional failures. He prioritized his ideological hatred over human life, viewing non-white individuals not as fellow citizens, but as targets for violent retribution. The early warning signs of his total unraveling were evident years before the tragedy. In 1993, Baumhammers was voluntarily hospitalized for psychiatric treatment after exhibiting delusional behavior during a trip to Europe. Over the next several years, he received ongoing psychiatric care and was prescribed antipsychotic medications, which he repeatedly stopped taking. During this period, he also legally purchased multiple handguns and formed a short-lived fringe political party advocating extreme anti-immigrant policies. Despite clear indicators of severe mental illness and growing ideological radicalization, no legal mechanisms were initiated to restrict his access to firearms. The tragedy reached its breaking point on the morning of April 28, 2000. Armed with a .357 Magnum revolver, Baumhammers left his parents' residence and initiated a calculated, multi-location shooting spree spanning several communities across Allegheny and Bever counties. He targeted individuals based entirely on their race, ethnicity, or religion. His rampage included attacks at a synagogue in Scott Township, a Jewish member's home, an Indian restaurant in Center Township, an Asian restaurant in Robinson Township, and an African-American job applicant at a martial arts school. In total, 5 people lost their lives that morning, and a 6th victim suffered permanent paralyzing injuries. The law enforcement response was swift and coordinated across multiple municipal departments. Using eyewitness descriptions of Baumhammers' vehicle and physical appearance, police tracked his movements as he fled back toward his parents' home in Moon Township. Officers intercepted his vehicle nearby and took him into custody without further violence, recovering the handgun and additional ammunition from his possession. The investigation produced an overwhelming body of physical evidence, including ballistics matches, eyewitness identifications, and extremist literature recovered from his personal belongings. In 2001, Baumhammers stood trial in Allegheny County. The defense presented extensive testimony from psychiatric experts arguing that Baumhammers suffered from schizophrenia and was legally insane at the time of the attacks. Prosecutors countered with evidence of deliberate planning, route selection, and awareness of legal wrongfulness. The jury rejected the insanity defense, convicting Baumhammers on 5 counts of first-degree murder and ethnic intimidation, resulting in a death sentence. Subsequent legal appeals focused extensively on his mental competency. In 2010, state courts upheld his convictions, but evaluated his ongoing psychiatric condition, ultimately leading to his housing in specialized state correctional medical facilities, where he remains incarcerated under life terms. The case of Richard Baumhammers remains a sobering study in the lethal intersection of severe, unmanaged psychiatric illness, ideological radicalization, and unchecked access to firearms. It serves as a lasting reminder of the devastating impact of hate-driven violence and the critical necessity of early intervention before extremist ideology turns into irreversible tragedy. Case 8. Joshua Powell. On the afternoon of February 5, 2012, an urgent call reached emergency dispatchers in Pierce County, Washington. A contract visitation supervisor stood outside a residential rental home in Graham, describing an immediate crisis. Minutes earlier, she had brought 7-year-old Charlie Powell and 5-year-old Braden Powell for a scheduled, court-authorized visit with their father, 33-year-old Joshua Powell. As the boys ran inside, Powell slammed the heavy wooden door and locked it from within, refusing to answer the supervisor's desperate knocks. Before first responders could reach the scene, neighbors reported a massive explosion that completely engulfed the house in flames. Inside, firefighters later recovered the remains of Powell and his 2 young sons. The disaster effectively ended the active search for his missing wife, 28-year-old Susan Powell, who had vanished under suspicious circumstances over 2 years earlier. To understand how he got here, we have to go back to the beginning. Joshua Vance Powell grew up in an environment marked by severe family dysfunction and emotional turmoil. Raised primarily by his father, Stephen Powell, in Washington state, he experienced a childhood defined by unusual family dynamics and an absence of healthy interpersonal boundaries. Those who knew him during his formative years described a quiet, reserved young man who struggled to establish emotional independence. His youth laid the groundwork for an adult life shaped by insecurity, rigid control, and a profound inability to manage personal conflict. In April 2001, Powell married Susan Marie Cox in Portland, Oregon. The couple eventually settled in West Valley City, Utah, where Susan worked as a successful financial investment coordinator, and Powell pursued various business ventures. They welcomed 2 sons, Charlie and Braden. To neighbors, church members, and casual acquaintances, the Powells appeared to be an ordinary suburban family trying to build a stable future. Beneath that outward appearance, however, lay a personality defined by severe possessiveness, financial secrecy, and an overwhelming need for complete authority over his domestic environment. Powell possessed an intense psychological fragility that viewed any assertion of independence by his wife as a threat to his self-worth. When financial difficulties mounted, leading to a bankruptcy filing in 2007, his controlling behavior intensified. Privately, Susan documented growing tension, financial manipulation, and domestic discord, even leaving a sealed note in a safety deposit box expressing fear for her personal safety. The early warning signs of total unraveling emerged on the morning of December 7, 2009. Susan failed to report for her job at Wells Fargo, and her young sons were not dropped off at daycare. When family members and law enforcement contacted Powell, he offered an extraordinary explanation. He claimed he had taken his 2 toddler sons on a late-night winter camping trip into the freezing Utah desert at 2 o'clock in the morning during a snowstorm. Detectives immediately noted profound inconsistencies in his timeline and demeanor. Search warrants executed at the West Valley City residence revealed trace blood evidence matching Susan on a couch, along with evidence that Powell had purchased a major life insurance policy on his wife months earlier. Although West Valley City Police designated Powell as the primary person of interest in Susan's disappearance, prosecutors lacked sufficient physical evidence to secure a formal homicide indictment, as her remains were never recovered. The spiral accelerated over the next 2 years. Powell relocated his sons to his father's house in Puyallup, Washington, aggressively contesting the ongoing police investigation. However, in late 2011, law enforcement executed search warrants on the father's residence, arresting Stephen Powell on charges related to voyeurism and illegal media. Recognizing the unsafe environment, State Child Protective Services intervened, placing Charlie and Braden into the temporary court-ordered custody of Susan's parents, Charles and Judith Cox. Powell was restricted to strictly supervised visitation. The psychological breaking point occurred in early 2012. Following a series of court hearings, a judge ordered Powell to undergo comprehensive psychological evaluations and polygraph testing before any consideration of regaining custody could occur. Realizing that law enforcement was closing in on digital evidence and that he was on the verge of permanently losing parental rights, Powell's illusion of control disintegrated entirely. On Sunday, February 5, 2012, Powell executed a calculated, catastrophic plan during a scheduled 3-hour supervised visit at his rented home in Graham. After tricking the visitation supervisor by shutting and locking the door, Powell took the lives of his 2 sons inside before igniting a fuel-air explosion using gasoline. The resulting fire consumed the entire structure in minutes, preventing any rescue attempts. The subsequent investigation by Washington state authorities and federal agents confirmed that the explosion was a deliberate act of arson, designed to prevent his sons from testifying or remaining in the custody of Susan's family. Forensic analysis of burned digital equipment recovered from the home revealed that Powell had sent final, cryptic communications to close relatives shortly before the fire, severing his remaining ties to society. The tragedy brought an abrupt end to legal proceedings, leaving Susan Powell's disappearance unresolved in court, though law enforcement publicly concluded that Joshua Powell was solely responsible for her loss. The case led to major national discussions regarding child visitation protocols during active criminal investigations and prompted significant legal changes regarding state oversight in high-risk custody disputes. The case of Joshua Powell remains a chilling study in ultimate domestic control and psychological destruction. When faced with the loss of authority, accountability, and public standing, he chose complete annihilation over facing justice, leaving behind a lasting legacy of unanswered questions and profound loss. Case 9, Christian Longo. On the afternoon of January 7, 2002, federal agents and Mexican federal police closed in on a small beach hostel in Cancun, Mexico. Inside, living under a stolen identity, was 27-year-old Christian Longo, an American citizen who had been named to the FBI's 10 most wanted list just days earlier. To the tourists and locals at the resort, Longo appeared to be a laid-back, charismatic travel writer named Michael Finkel. In reality, he was fleeing from a horrifying discovery made weeks earlier along the rugged coastline of Lincoln County, Oregon. Within days of his capture, Longo was extradited back to the United States, where he was tried, convicted of capital murder, and sentenced to death. To understand how he got here, we have to go back to the beginning. Christian Michael Longo grew up in a strict, highly regulated religious household in Michigan. Raised within a close-knit religious community, he was expected to adhere to high moral standards and demonstrate obedience from an early age. Those who knew him during his youth described a charming, intelligent young man who possessed a natural ability to connect with others and project confidence. However, beneath his polite exterior, Longo harbored a dangerous obsession with material wealth and social status that far exceeded his financial means. In the mid-1990s, Longo married his wife, Mary Jane, and together they began building a life that appeared on the surface to be the epitome of suburban success. They eventually welcomed 3 children, 4-year-old Zachary, 3-year-old Sadie, and 2-year-old Madison. Settling in Michigan and later moving to Oregon, Longo established a construction cleanup business. To neighbors and church acquaintances, the Longos were an attractive, devoted young family living an ideal life. Beneath that polished image lay a deeply flawed personality defined by pathological narcissism, compulsive lying, and a total inability to accept failure. Longo derived his self-worth entirely from presenting an image of prosperity, and when his legitimate business attempts failed to generate the income needed to support his lavish spending, he routinely turned to illegal methods. Rather than adjusting his lifestyle or seeking help, Longo possessed an extreme psychological fragility that viewed any reduction in social standing as an unbearable humiliation. The early warning signs of his total unraveling emerged in the late 1990s through a growing trail of financial deception. Longo began creating counterfeit checks, stealing credit cards, and fabricating loan documents to maintain his lifestyle. In Michigan, his fraudulent activities caught the attention of law enforcement, resulting in probation and mounting debts. Instead of reforming, Longo packed up his family and relocated to Oregon in late 2001, abandoning his liabilities and attempting to start anew. However, the pattern repeated itself almost immediately as he continued generating fake checks and accumulating massive unpaid bills. By December 2001, the financial walls were closing in completely. Eviction notices, unpaid rent, and impending criminal charges for check fraud threatened to expose his elaborate web of lies to his wife and community. Realizing that his carefully constructed persona was on the verge of total public collapse, Longo reached a chilling conclusion. He decided that eliminating his family was preferable to facing the public shame of his fraudulent life. In mid-December 2001, Longo carried out his systematic plan. Inside their rented home, he took the lives of his wife, Mary Jane, and their 3 young children. Over the course of several days, he concealed their remains in suitcases and pillowcases, transporting them to isolated coastal sites, including Lint Slough and Yaquina Bay along the Oregon coast. Shortly after, Longo cleared out his remaining assets, stole a former employer's credit card information, and fled the country on a flight to Mexico. The investigation began on December 19, 2001, when a local resident discovered the remains of young Zachary Longo floating in Lint Slough. Divers subsequently recovered the remains of Sadie Longo nearby, and days later, authorities located Mary Jane and Madison in the trunk of an abandoned vehicle. Lincoln County detectives and the FBI quickly identified Christian Longo as the sole suspect, launching an international manhunt that led directly to Cancun, where he was apprehended without incident. During his 2003 trial in Lincoln County, prosecutors presented a formidable case featuring forensic evidence, financial records, and witness testimony, proving Longo acted with calculated premeditation to escape his debts. Although Longo took the stand and attempted a bizarre defense, claiming his wife had harmed 2 of the children and that he had reacted in panic, the jury rejected his story entirely. Longo was convicted on 4 counts of aggravated murder and sentenced to death. The case of Christian Longo stands as a disturbing study in how pathological narcissism and extreme financial deceit can lead to complete domestic destruction. When faced with the exposure of his lies, he sacrificed his entire family to preserve a false image, leaving a lasting impact on the justice system and true crime history. Case 10. Robert Bever. On the night of July 22, 2015, emergency dispatchers in Broken Arrow, Oklahoma, received a low-whispered 911 call from inside a residence on Magnolia Court. The caller, 12-year-old Daniel Bever, frantically alerted authorities that his household was under attack from within, nomming his older brothers before the line was cut. Within minutes, tactical officers arrived at the quiet suburban home, breaching the front door to find a scene of severe domestic devastation. Emerging from the rear of the property, 2 figures clad in dark tactical gear fled into the nearby woods. A police K-9 unit tracked the pair into a muddy creek bed, apprehending 18-year-old Robert Bever and his 16-year-old brother Michael, without further incident. The arrest brought a sudden end to what investigators discovered was supposed to be the opening act of a nationwide killing spree. To understand how they got here, we have to go back to the beginning. Robert Bever grew up in Broken Arrow, a peaceful suburb of Tulsa. He was the eldest of 7 children born to David Bever, a corporate IT professional, and April Bever, a stay-at-home mother. The entire family lived an exceptionally quiet life, with all 7 children educated exclusively through homeschooling. To neighbors, the Bevers appeared to be a deeply private, self-contained household whose children were rarely seen beyond their own backyard. As Robert transitioned into adulthood, his physical isolation from society coincided with an increasingly unmonitored digital life. Lacking external social outlets, sports leagues, or school counselors, he spent long hours in a shared bedroom navigating extreme corners of the internet. Over time, he drew his younger brother Michael into a shared obsession, shifting their focus away from typical teenage interests toward a dark fixation on historical mass crimes and violent notoriety. Beneath his quiet exterior, Robert harbored a profound psychological disturbance marked by intense grandiosity, extreme misanthropy, and a total absence of empathy. He derived his sense of purpose from a desire to surpass historical mass murder statistics, believing that achieving extreme public notoriety was the only way to make his existence meaningful. Robert viewed his family not as individuals to protect, but as initial obstacles to eliminate in order to launch his grander master plan. The early warning signs unfolded throughout early 2015 through deliberate, secret preparations. Taking a part-time job at a local call center, Robert saved his earnings specifically to purchase military-style equipment online. Over several months, the brothers ordered Kevlar body armor, tactical helmets, combat boots, and dozens of sharp-edged tools, tracking package deliveries to intercept them before their parents noticed. Days before the incident, Robert attempted to purchase firearms online, planning to pick them up from a local dealer, alongside thousands of rounds of ammunition scheduled for delivery. The plan reached its execution point on the evening of July 22, 2015. Donning their tactical gear, Robert and Michael initiated a systematic attack inside the residence, while the rest of the family prepared for sleep. They targeted their mother, April, and father, David, before turning their attention to their younger siblings. Despite the chaos, 12-year-old Daniel locked himself inside an office to make his heroic 911 call, while 13-year-old Crystal Bever survived critical injuries, bravely resisting the attack. Upstairs, their 23-month-old sister, Autumn, slept through the event entirely unharmed. The law enforcement response was swift. Driven by Daniel's precise address disclosure, Broken Arrow police officers arrived at 709 Magnolia Court within 5 minutes. Officers immediately rendered trauma care to Crystal on the front porch, saving her life while securing the perimeter. Realizing that law enforcement had arrived far faster than their timeline allowed, Robert and Michael panicked, abandoning their plan to hijack the family vehicle and fleeing out the back door into the woods, where police K-9 units apprehended them at 12:18 a.m. During formal interrogations, Robert spoke to detectives with chilling detachment, admitting to the attack and expressing frustration only that Daniel's quick 911 call had foiled their planned multi-state campaign. In 2016, to spare his surviving sisters from a lengthy trial, Robert pleaded guilty to 5 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of assault with intent to kill. He was sentenced to 6 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. Michael was later tried as an adult in 2018, convicted, and sentenced to consecutive life terms. The case of Robert Bever stands as a chilling study in how extreme domestic isolation and unmonitored digital radicalization can foster unthinkable violence behind closed doors. It remains a lasting reminder of the critical importance of behavioral vigilance and early intervention in protecting vulnerable lives.